Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds. I wanted to make a couple of announcements first. Next week, our Grand Rounds will be, it's not really going to be a memorial Grand Rounds, even though that is what it is in some sense. It's really going to be one with a rich scientific program, but it's in honor of the life and legacy of Connie Lieber, who really was the kind of guiding spirit behind what used to be NARSAD and now is Brain Behavior Research Foundation, which is really the biggest private source of funding of mental illness-related research in the country. And I think anybody in academic psychiatry got their start with something from NARSAD or BBRF in terms of a young investigator grant or an independent investigator grant. So it's a tremendous legacy. It's sort of like a Mary Lasker kind of thing. So in order to honor Connie, we're going to have 4 people who have had largely been recipients of that support in the course of their work, and then also someone who was just closely associated with bringing them to support work at Columbia specifically. So it'll be a life, a legacy supporting brain research and mental illness, a scientific tribute to Connie Lieber, and the presenters will be John Javich, Eric Kandel, Alice Medaglia, and Herb Hardis. A couple of announcements. Erica Chen and Warren Ng were the kind of lead individuals who received a $10.3 million grant over 4 years from the Criminal Justice Investment Initiative. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of the program is, but it's a lot of money for a good thing, and so congratulations to them. Mark Olson received a 5-year grant from NIDA for a project on healthcare policy and substance abuse treatment access, and Barbara Stanley received I didn't know the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention gave such big grants, but almost a $600,000 grant from AFSP for a project on safety planning and intervention to reduce short-term suicide risk. So congratulations to them. It's really a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I mean, actually to get her over here because she's so busy, Dr. Karina Davidson. Karina hails from our neighbor to the north, and I often am increasingly saying I have Canada envy when it comes to things like complex health or social policy issues that they seem to do better than us, including healthcare. But Karina received a bachelor's degree from Queen's University, and then a master's and PhD from Waterloo University in clinical psychology, but also organizational psychology. And then went on to hold a series of postdoctoral and early faculty positions before coming to Mount Sinai, where in 2003, was it? She was lured across town to Columbia in the Department of Medicine. And in addition to establishing her own research program, she also was closely attracted to and then closely aligned with the work that Richard Sloan had been doing at our own department. And that's because the focus of her research was on the psychosocial risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease and their course and outcome. And this really is a central pillar in the sort of expanding foundation of what's become known as behavioral medicine, which is hugely consequential, but unfortunately not adequately represented in terms of our models of healthcare service delivery. But she has really been a leading figure in this area. But because of her range of talents, it's the no good deed goes unpunished thing, she's gotten drawn into a variety of roles at Columbia and NYP, hence the fact that she has more titles than you can. I'd probably take up all grand rounds if I went through all of them. But in summary, she's now the Vice Dean for Organizational Effectiveness at P&S for Columbia, the Chief Academic Officer for NewYork-Presbyterian Hospital, Executive Director for the Center of Behavior and Cardiovascular Health, and Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry at Columbia. And what she's talking to us here today really is kind of a hybrid of her research career, but then applied to or using her organizational management and systems skills to determine how to establish an effective, an efficient, and productive system for pursuing academic work, medical work in the context of grants, research, and so forth. And being that she has been so successful at doing this, we wanted to have her come and share her experience and wisdom with us, and in essence, hopefully share the wealth. So here's the title. Please welcome Dr. Karina Davidson.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here today. This is going to be a slightly different grand rounds, I suspect, than you're used to. I'm really going to try and take you through the process of how we have improved our academic productivity and ability to work across all of the different disciplines that are inside the center. We have cardiologists, internists, sociologists, vascular biologists, exercise physiologists, clinical psychologists, statisticians, as well as postdocs, fellows from all of those and more of the medical areas. And so thinking through the system that allows everybody's academic career to flourish, for them to actually enjoy doing science while being busy clinically or in whatever else their day job is a piece of what I'm going to talk to you about, and then I'm going to show you how it applied to one of our projects. So I have no conflicts to declare. I'm hoping to teach you about some of the ways behavior change theories have been applied actually to the process of getting research done. I'm going to tell you some of the latest findings in creativity science and perhaps teach you some tips and tricks of things you could be taking into your own area of intellectual inquiry, how to improve your research productivity, and just a tiny little bit about the complexities that reign in the data streams that come in about 30-day readmission rates. So I'm going to start by telling you just a bit about our center that's across the street in Department of Medicine. We sit within the Division of Cardiology. We have high aspirations, which I will let you read here. And I'm really going to be focusing on the bottom one, what we have done in our shop to enhance the academic potential and productivity of our junior faculty, because we think that's where the future lies and that's where we need to be investing our resources. And we're trying to take systems engineering and industrial organizational psychology principles to ways that we teach, train, mentor, nourish, and launch independent investigators. So I have here for you just a word cloud out of our publications for 2016. That's to show you the kind of research that we work on. And so the problem that we have in doing research together is if you look through some of those words, they're fairly disparate disciplines or areas. As you know, in a word cloud, the size of the word is how many times it's cited in the title of the publications. This is our organization. One of the things we did in a previous iteration, once a year we go through a systems improvement process. We have a retreat. We talk about what our challenges were and therefore what our opportunities were, what our successes are that we're going to bake into the way we do things. And 2 years ago, we reorganized all of our functions into what we call tanks. So we have the research execution core, the data core, the administrative core, and the research production core. What the research execution core does is that we actually pool all of our nurses, all of our research assistants, all of our lab techs into one tank or core that is co-led by two people, and they're given the 27 NIH projects that we have with the mandate of cross-training all of the people to do all of the tasks where needed. It's not everyone knows everything, but if this one needs 5 RAs, and therefore their estimate is they need to have 2 people who have cross-training to cover those 5 when they're sick, when there's a push, when there's a crisis, then they've identified who are the 2 who are back up to those 5. If another project only needs 1 RA and that person isn't fully used, that person then becomes one of the backup. If this project is low level or unfunded and, a pilot fund, maybe we don't have a backup. So they have an execution plan like a company about how they're going to take their 40 staff and make sure that every single thing that needs to be done for all of the execution of our already funded grants is happening, and curating the pipeline of unfunded pilots. So for unfunded pilots, we have a process that people write a one-pager on what it is they want to do and what it would take to do it, and this execution core looks at where they have excess capacity, or a research assistant who's looking for new training and tells us we can run 3 pilots this quarter. This quarter, we've got a full push for 3 randomized control trials. We can do no pilots. So it's everybody working together in a way to maximize efficiency in executing this core. This core we have focused on for a number of years, and it's sort of like a smooth engine. It works fairly clearly. The data core took us a while to get to. We had separate statisticians working on separate grants with separate expertise and data sets sitting in separate places with different data sharing agreements and different security levels, because sometimes they were on someone's desktop, and if that desktop got in a flood, which happened, that was not backed up, even though that PI thought that they had a backup system for that particular desktop. So we then started centralizing all of the operations of the data core as well, with the cross-training, with using one server, with having naming conventions for all of the variables so that they're all the same. And then came up with a hybrid system where we have 2 statisticians who are with us full-time, who are working on all of the grants that are going out, but we have 5 that we've worked out with the Department of Biostats, who are paid to work with this team on the various grants that need their kind of expertise. The administrative core is the administrative core. It's sort of standard. But what was fun for us was in the last year, we worked out that we had done system design for getting grants out, and I'm going to show you what we do to get grants out, for executing grants, for getting the data, and we were just saying to our 27 or so faculty, postdocs, part-time people, go forth and write. And it turns out, go forth and write to busy people who have clinical schedules, who've got residents they're training, who are giving talks, who are writing grants on deadlines, doesn't actually produce what is most useful for that individual or for the group. So we decided to staff a experimental research production core where it started with one single person, Laura Melly. We've now moved to, we're at about 2.5 FTE. They met with each individual investigator, found out what manuscripts they were working on, got them to prioritize them, got them to say what their barriers were, and then went and problem solved those barriers. So I'll just tell you a couple of quick things that happened. One person would schedule time in their calendar and then sit and do clinical notes and answer emails. So Laura went and sat with that person with a laptop with other work she was working on and prevented them from getting on clinical notes and answering the phone, and immediately manuscripts started coming out. Somebody else just couldn't get it together to be fact-checking their references, and so they had a fully written manuscript that sat on their desk for 6 months. So there's a librarian who fact-checks now all of the references before they go out. Somebody else had a data replication problem. Laura took the data set, took it back to the data core, got the statistician, said this needs to be replicated. So any problem that was stopping someone from getting a manuscript, it was her job. It's sort of like a 3-1-1. Somebody else wasn't good at making figures. And it's like, then let's not torture you. If you can write, we'll find somebody to make you the figures. So that started to allow us to track where were their problems and what was going on with each individual person, which is how we got to the 2.5 FTE. We now have people who are sort of doing functions that we saw across 27 people. Each individual person was having a problem with. It was a rate limiting step for them, just focusing on writing up their science. Because now we had a great execution core who always makes enrollment, always gets reports drafted, always gets things out. We have a great grants system, which I'm going to be showing you in a moment, and we had great data, and then the data was sitting, waiting for people to work on it. Yes? Go for it.
This is a research center.
Yes, but almost everyone practices.
So my question is, the infrastructure you have, what is
The financial, so the question is, what is the financial model that we have no donor money, we have no any indirects that come, we have no money other than NIH funding that pays for this. This is from direct. It is from both direct. I would say 85, well, I actually know the number. It's 89% is from direct. So I now write in a manuscript production cost to each R01 because I know that we don't get 15 to 20 manuscripts out on an R01 if I'm not managing that system. So we are running at about, I'm going to show you in a minute, about 8 million total NIH dollars per year. And in the AIM High model, that ends up with about 11% indirect. And I use that only for the people who I cannot pay, legitimately from direct, people who are doing post-grant production or straight administrative functions. NHLBI, a large portion now from NIA. We have a couple of contracts from NCI. No. Because we just explain, we show metrics, which I'm going to show you. So, this is the fun experiment we did 1 year ago. I told you that we did the research dissemination core. They've now also taken on marketing of our information, getting press releases out, looking at people's H-index. That's why that has grown. But this is what we did last year, and then I'm telling you, this is what we did last year, and then 2 years ago, sorry, and then I'm going to tell you what we did last year. So, we have an administrative core that was being told by 27 people, oh, I think I'm submitting an R01, oh, I think I'm submitting a K, or I'm hoping to get in that Robert Wood Johnson scholarship. And that was all unmanaged. So sometimes they'd have 15 grants they were trying to get through in a cycle, and other cycles they'd have 0, because it was just as investigators were saying, I'm ready to do something, they tell them sort of with 3 weeks notice. So we decided, we sat in a 2-day retreat, and this was our focus of what we were going to completely radically design differently for our group. It's gone through many iterations, and it was an experiment, so I'm going to show you the data from it. We decided we were going to write grants collectively together. So much of what we do is that there are synergies or efficiencies that can be gained if the system works well, if you put people together. So this is the first iteration, and then I'm going to tell you how we iterated differently. Everybody in the group, 27 of us, had to come up with 30 grant ideas. They weren't one-pagers that were written out. They were asking each person, if you were to do the most important science, the most exciting science that you could do, what would that idea be? Not do you have pilot data, not is that something that you've published in for the last 15 papers, but really let's spend 2 weeks talking to each other about what we're passionate about, what we think is important, what is if you were going to die in 5 years, what is the science you wished you'd spent your time doing? Number 2, we then went into a retreat It was a day long. In the morning, each person, just for 10 minutes, pitched that idea, and nobody was allowed to edit, be critical, say that would never happen. This was the generative part of our science. You could ask clarifying questions. From there, we then set up a rating sheet, and people would just say, you know, on the approach, innovation, investigators, we just, first iteration, had people write their numbers for the idea without knowing details, not reading the approach, but like, does that sound like a good experimental idea? Do I think that would really be innovative and be impactful? And then we spent the afternoon what we called balancing the portfolio. Then we'd start going, well, Blair needs to be a PI this cycle, and this person needs a K, and that person needs 40% of their salary covered, but they don't need to be a PI. So we sort of took, in consideration of the numbers that we got, what's the balanced portfolio? Oh, this one requires Joe to be the statistician on 15 of them. That's not going to work. So some of those have to go, which are the lowest. So we thought through the dimensions that we had to optimize on. We came up with, out of there, about 15 that we then went into, so this is the create portfolio, then we voted on the sort of portfolio. Then we went into what we thought was innovative, a 2-week period where teams were formed for those 15 grants. You now wrote the one-pager, and you got your power analysis, you made sure that the budget was wrong, and each team was trying to kill everyone else's idea. So look for the fatal flaw. Look for it before someone's invested in it, dedicated to it, believes it's the right thing to do, right? All they've done is they've spent 4 or 5 days writing, and someone's pointed out a hole to them. So it moves from generative to as critical as you possibly can be, because what I don't want is junior people spending 3 or 4 years going after an idea that ultimately is not fundable and that isn't seen as exciting and important by more senior colleagues. So everyone knew this isn't personal, this isn't about your idea, this is just, nothing gets through this process that when poked as hard as it can be is not 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, at least at the one-page stage. So the idea was to kill off about 7. You know, some it might be you don't have the pilot data yet, so it can go into a future cycle. Some it's like, no, that is fatally flawed, it's permanently dead. So there was a resuscitation area, but most of the others went out. Then we reformed our teams into the 7 or 8. We wrote for 2 weeks, we submitted, and we started the next cycle. One of the iterations I added, which I'm now hoping you'll see how radical this was, I told the MDs on the second cycle they must have a vacation for 2 weeks and be not sleep deprived, that is sleep restored, before they went into the generative part. Now, the first time I said that, they all went off and moonlit and covered all the things that they were supposed to be doing while they had been busy writing. But you can't have your best ideas. You can't write an R01 in 2 weeks. You can't immediately and clearly see what that fatal flaw is in someone's if you're sleep deprived, if you're stressed, and if you're juggling all sorts of things. So they didn't believe me. They went off and they worked 80 hours a week. Their ideas weren't great. The second cycle didn't go so great. I said, you're getting 3 R01s out this year. You have to give me 2 weeks. You know, like, work with your clinical schedule. And of course, if you count it up, there were 4 or 5 other weeks that they could be doing things. It's just the 2 weeks prior to running this marathon, they had to be fresh and started. So the third cycle, they believed me. They all managed to be quieter for those 2 weeks, to read books they cared about, to go to the beach for 1 weekend. That's where you have your good ideas. It's not at 3 in the morning when you're on the CCU dealing with 14 very sick patients. I wish it was. If you could multitask that way, that'd be great, but I just empirically have not found that to be the case. So we iterated this every cycle we went. We got fairly complicated in the multidimensional grid in which we started rating things as we were going through the pitch. But the really weird thing that happened is we had fun. this is a team sport for us, and we enjoy sitting in our conference room writing those R01s together, because there's 6 or 7 people who are working, there's other people coming in and bringing them data, there's other people figuring out from the data team, what are the tables that need to be done for these 6 things, and people getting excited and showing what the data visualization team has done with something, so everybody feels that sense of energy and optimism, and that shows up in the writing. That it's not a lone PI sitting in the office at 2 in the morning trying to get this thing done. We're doing 3 cycles a year. One of the things I didn't plan on is, of course, the bounce back, that it doesn't get funded the first time. So the first ones that we put in didn't get funded the first time, and that meant 1 month later, we had to do a second bolus of writing. And that's when I started saying, I need rested people, because you're going to go through a marathon, and then you're going to do a sprint at the end, and then you can have 4 weeks, and then we've got to start again. So in the middle phases, we were submitting for PCORI. We were doing this because we had 2 program projects, and NHLBI went to a 1.0 as what you had to get in order to get funded, and we strategically thought we're not going to spend the time writing 2 PPGs twice with the likelihood that they won't get funded, both of them, because a 1.0 from 27 scientists is a fairly rare thing, not 1.1, but 1.0. And so we had to believe they were going to be sunsetted, and we had to replace with 6 R01s to keep our funding structure. So if you can see these numbers, there's cycle 1, how many we submitted, cycle 2, cycle 3, cycle 1 of the next year. Cycle 2 of 2015, we'd actually overreached our mark. We'd gotten to 8 R01s, and so I told everyone, you're now on manuscripts. So we purposefully slowed down a little bit. And then we're picking up in 2016 because, of course, we're trying to get a pipeline going rather than we need to, and we want to spread them out rather than we have to do this process every year. So for that year experiment, we got 6 R01s, 1 KO1, 1 U24, 1 N of 1 contract. We opened a clinical 24-hour blood pressure monitoring clinic, and we got an NYP grant for quality improvement. So I'm just showing you what we look like now. Because everyone was writing grants, our manuscripts dropped off. Right? It's always a system problem. So I'm just showing you a little bit of what Laura and her team started to implement to try and help support the science writers. You complete a proposal form. It gets circulated to the data team biostats core, who gives an estimate of when they can turn it around. We actually, because we enjoyed writing the grants so much, we have our conference room booked for Wednesdays. There's coffee in there. There's quiet time. If you want to talk, there's a little ante room you can go into. Everyone brings their laptop and they work on their manuscripts. So everybody has social support while they're doing what's really an introverted task, but it's scheduled and the data team is on notice. They're not taking any requests there, and they just sit there waiting for someone to say, I need a table, I need this, I need that. And so you get that feeling of forward movement. Once a week, you're actually seeing your manuscripts materially advance. And then they figure out the journal. They've got someone who's figuring out what's the best journal for this to go to, who's doing the copy formatting for it to go to that journal, and tracking the progress so we can keep our metrics. We had I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We had 6 funded data sets that I felt were laying fallow. They just hadn't been mined for data. So we set up a competition with points, and there were teams set up for each of the data sets, people who were attracted to that area of science, and they all went into a writing competition to see who could beat who to get out the most manuscripts in 1 month. And in 1 month, we got that done. The research assistants wanted to have, because they were co-authors who were writing method sections and whatnot, they wanted to compete for the ability to submit it as a poster or a presentation in which we would partially pay for their conference, which we did. There was talk about Starbucks cards, but I can never figure out how to do that in the CUMC system. So there's you're seeing in light green, are publications that came as a result of that push to get the manuscripts going. We had 51 published in journals with more than a 5 impact factor, including those. Our number of citations is up to 1826, and we've had 638 publications out of our center with what started as 5 faculty. We're now to 9 full-time faculty, and it depends on how you count FTEs of fellows, because we have people who really are still residents and rotate in to work with us. But I say we're somewhere between 15 and 19, depending on how you count those 3 months they have that they come in and work with us. So Laura's very proud of this. We produce 1 unique peer-reviewed journal every 4 days, and our H-index has increased from 33 to 43 as a group. So I wanted to pause here and answer any questions or comments, and then I'm going to sort of show you how we took this kind of process into actually running a grant. Does it sound like fun? You all sort of are looking very quietly at me.
What came to my mind was that what you've done for academic medicine, what have you worked into you basically systematized the process. It looks very impressive. The question is who makes it work? Who actually, you set it up, you have the individuals who are so forth, and something like right.
So what I care about, sometimes people say this looks like the Ford process to me. I care about people having joy and positive affect at work and actually following what they love. So that is something I hope I've done differently. I hire as leads of my cores people who have very high emotional intelligence or EQ and very high executive function. So I look for the non-neurotic closer who's looking for their own career path. And all of, we actually started thinking we're going to start tracking how many of our RAs get into medical school and PhD, because everybody's career trajectory is known to each of these leads, and they're constantly looking for opportunities. This person needs a co-authorship. This person needs to go to a conference to show that they can do this. This person wants to learn phlebotomy. How can we have them be the backup to the, to the phlebotomist, the full-time phlebotomist? So everybody's seeing that their career is progressing as part of this, which I think is slightly different than the industrial Ford sort of. No, I'm just trying to clarify. And that adds energy to the system. That's what I think I've done. I've shown people that if you're having trouble writing, we're going to help you. If you're having trouble getting the analyses from the statistician, we're going to help you. It's not going to be one-off by people coming to me and saying, will you please talk to the senior person and get him to do this thing? We're trying to get away from those individual asks and that individual ownership that you have to sit by yourself and worry that these pieces aren't working very well for you. A big piece of it, I've gone around to different divisions over in medicine and said, this is what we do, is trust. You have to trust your colleagues. You have to say, I have your back and you have mine. You need an R01, I don't need one this cycle, I'm all yours. I'm writing on your team. Now, my person needs a K. You're all over it. You're helping this cycle because you got your R01 in. So that takes some time to get a culture in a small group where it's the right phenotype, it's everyone understanding that we're here for each other as much as we are for ourselves, and all boats float, if that helps. Yes? So the question is that they're very diverse science. We write basic science, we write epidemiology, we write clinical trials, we're writing for policy things. Once you get non-defensive about what you're good at and what you're not good at, then everybody's horse trading. So you're writing basic science and I don't know about that, but I can help with the data visualization. You show me what you're trying to show, or gee, I'm reading this and I'm an outside reviewer, I don't see your experimental design, I can help get you a visual of what your experiment is. I'm worried about your power. I don't know why you're powering it that way. I'm going to go spend 2 hours for you with the statistician and see if we can figure that out, and then I'm going to work with the budget person. That's what I'm doing when I don't understand particularly the science that's being done by the endothelial progenitor cell person. I can help. They can help me by being an outside reader to my depression screening trial and saying, gee, from my perspective, I don't see this, or I'm going to. So we say what we can do and we help each other. One of the great things we've done is for the manuscript competition, we have some people who are great editors. They're very critical. I made them keep their mouths shut when we're doing the brainstorming, and I'd have to look at them and go, you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to talk. Because the first thing they see is what's wrong. They have trouble getting first drafts done because they're editing all the time. So I paired them with some of my more grandiose writers, and as long as people saw, look, I can bang out an absolutely over-the-top, making extravagant claim manuscripts in a day. It's just it needs to be fact-checked, and I don't have any references in there, and I'm overreaching on the data. I give that to the most critical editor, who then has a draft to work with. And the two of them start producing instead of the one person gets their papers rejected all the time because they're not appropriate for peer review, and the other person can't initiate. So we're honest with each other about what we like doing, where our strengths are, and then we find pairings or triads for the particular task at hand. Yes?
It seems like the thing that keeps us from being an assembly line is you. So how do you build that into a system?
I reinforce like crazy pro-social behavior, and I do not tolerate bullies, psychopaths, anybody who's in it for themselves. I do not. One instance of that out of anyone in any place, and they're out of, we call it a socialistic collective, and that only works if everyone is pro-social.
Someone else who wants to set up the system.
I think it's setting clear expectations by the leader and living it. So, I really, I don't know if I can express this with the amount of feeling I have, but my joy is when my mentees do well. When they get an award or they get their first R01, it really makes my world rock. When I get another R01, who cares? Really honestly, like I need it in order to keep the funding up and whatnot, but it's boring. I think where you can live to show that, what we're here for is educating the residents, teaching the medical students, helping junior faculty find their voice for what it is they want to do. That's why we're here in an academic health center. And if you show that in your behavior and don't tolerate the other behavior, and I think all of us culturally have trouble with as bystanders, letting bullying, exploitative behavior occur and not stepping in and doing something about it, either because it's not within our area of command and control or because it's just the norm in whatever, particular group we're in. That's, I think, where it gets hard to think through how you're going to change that culture. I promote the people who show that pro-social behavior. So I'm going to give you an example. The person who's the current director of our center, I've become the executive director, when he had 2 R01s, and a third about to be funded, and we had a brand new fellow who got a K on the first trial. We were out of single offices, and our rule was once you got a K, you got a single office. And he said, I'm going to move my desk into the data team, the 6-person Carol, and give her my single office. Because we can't have it be that this rule applies just to the first person who got here. And I'm like, you're my next leader. So if you'll find those people, and if they get reinforced and somebody shows them that there's a way for them, it's not just that they're held around exploiters, I think that makes a big difference. Okay, so I'm going to use this one. I'm now going to tell you about a really fun grant we got that I thought, ooh, this is something we can play with, in large part because of Harold Pincus. He proposed to ECRIP that they start thinking about grouping single trainees together to have a larger group that could be working on one focus rather than 3 people in individual little places. So we thought, what would be really cool and fun to do if we were to put in for one of those, because we'd never put in for one. And at that time, 30-day readmission rates were going to have an incredible penalty for the hospitals, and the first conditions had been announced, and it was heart failure. I'm talking about this because we started learning about creativity science through this project, so that the learning about creativity science and how we worked with a very diverse team is a lot from this grant what influenced some of the things we've done to change the way we have improved productivity. So ECRIP is the Empire Clinical Research Improvement Program that is run by the New York Department of Health in order to help new physicians who have a license in New York, trained in New York, or reside in New York to launch their health services or translational research. And it's a grant that comes through the hospital rather than through NIH or CDC or any of the other funding agencies we typically go to.
And listen, Harold, this is something where there's money available and we don't necessarily apply for it. I send it around there.
So we use this as a chance to do something outside of our bailiwick. That's often how we figure out, is this an area of science we're interested in? So we sort of started thinking of some health systems things we would do. I found this article from 1956. It's actually from here. PI, in which was the first published instance we could find in peer-reviewed literature that mentioned readmission. And it refers to any patient returned for further care, whether 1 day, 1 month, or many years after medical staff gave approval for the patient's discharge to community life. This article basically says it's a failure of the system when a patient has to be returned for care, which I thought was a noble sentiment and a higher aspiration for readmission work. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. In the 2000s, as you know, many Medicare patients are readmitted early after discharge. It's 15 to 20%, and at a very high level, when you're looking at an entire system and not thinking about the complexity of any individual patient, it's seen as a marker for quality of care. That is, there are gaps in transition of care or poor medication reconciliation. Those were the hypotheses as to why that rate was so high. There is a very distinct geographic variation for rates of readmission, and even when they adjust for many possible confounders, CMI mix, age, all of those things, you still see this variation, which again led many to believe that it's possibly a marker of quality of care. So in 2014, the penalties started applying. The average penalty was about 0.38%, but there were winners and losers in hospitals because you had to meet certain metrics and show certain improvements. So the first thing we did in thinking about this problem was that we really wanted to scope what we were trying to do to just those preventable readmissions versus necessary readmissions. And in the CMS first iteration of the calculation, if somebody was coming in for needed care, that counted. We thought, we're not interested in intervening on those cases that need to come in, that are deemed necessary. We need to have some definition of people for whom it actually was preventable, because those probably have root causes of things that we could actually try and fix that would improve patient care. So we started to meet as a group to talk about how to identify patients at risk for these unnecessary or preventable readmissions. And we started thinking about all of the factors at the level of the patients, the hospitals, or the providers that could lead to these unnecessary or preventable readmissions. So because I'm a clinical psychologist and because some of the people on this team are thinking about the behavior of systems, whether it's a provider or the entire healthcare system, we started in our brainstorming, our initial brainstorming of what we were going to do, thinking about the patient, the hospital, and the provider. And we started reviewing literature like this. If you actually look at the meds that a patient comes into the ED for heart failure, it's actually these kinds of drugs that I've highlighted for you in red, or pink, I guess, that at least predict an increased chance of all readmissions. Getting to data sets that you could parse into the necessary versus unnecessary is not out in the published literature, and we started thinking about how we would start setting up algorithms to separate those two. But we wanted to know what kind of variables we would be putting into the system once we had parsed that. Also, at the provider level, the decision to readmit is made, and there are clearly some preventable readmissions that occur, particularly within our system because of a discontinuity of care. However, there's the paradoxical effect that risk aversion can also increase readmissions. So we're still looking within the conventional literature. We're just looking at what other people have done out in the published literature to think through what we're going to do. Here you see that if you actually refer back to somebody who is familiar to the patient versus either a no follow-up visit or somebody who they don't know, you see a quite big separation in curve in readmission rates. So, you know, we're again learning about this area. We're trying to pull in pieces of things that we think are actionable and that we could make our science about. So yet more conventional approaches we saw in the published literature, people trying to lower barriers to reach across healthcare institutions. So those are the health information exchanges, phone hotlines. We found a number of best practices between healthcare systems, that one healthcare system could call another healthcare system with one single phone number to talk about a patient who'd had a recent hospitalization at the other healthcare system to try and coordinate across. We also saw people using decision support tools, whether electronic or on paper, to clarify readmission risk in order to come up with a care pathway to use for the high risk patients. And again, from a behavioral perspective, I saw many penalties only, as which I call blunt instruments to change behavior, using resource constraints, penalizing Medicare reimbursement rates. All of those are penalties if you don't do the right thing. And of course, it has the unintended consequence for the safety net hospitals that if they don't meet their targets, they're the ones who get the penalties, and they're often not the healthcare systems that can afford, they're running so close to the bone, that's exactly not where you want them. So again, an unintended consequence of trying to alter the behavior to lower the preventable admissions because it was considered a marker of quality of care. So another conventional way of thinking about this problem was to look for features of high-performing systems. When I showed you that geographic variation, you go to the places that have low readmission rates, you try and figure out what they're doing, and you simply adopt it. Yet another was to align incentives with desired behavior rather than aligning just a blunt instrument of a penalty. There were all sorts of unintended consequences in this literature, which I found interesting. You could change the number of admissions, but you didn't change your rate because you did an overall quality improvement to your system, and so you kept out the unnecessary initial admissions. And so your readmission rate actually stayed the same or got worse. Does that make sense to people? So, it's very interesting, all the things that were tried that had so many downstream unintended consequences. And there's showing you that you can you can do the right thing and actually get penalized. So we decided that what we would propose is a think tank of people scientists from biomedical informatics, engineering, cardiology, general internal medicine, emergency medicine, the CTSA, and our group, and that we wanted to only look at the things that hadn't been looked at before, so novel hospital system care processes and patient factors that adversely influence 30-day readmissions. And we actually wanted to try and intervene or target those to see if we could reduce readmission rates while increasing patient satisfaction. So as a think tank, we then did a deep dive into what are the empirical data about how you increase your creativity. And we wanted to do this because if you read the literature, then you come up with ideas that other people have or variations on ideas other people have, and then you do those things. That's probably a safe way to publication because, people understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. But we thought this is a fun grant that we can actually try and do something completely different. So we went and we looked at all of the literature we could find on creativity, on promoting creativity amongst scientists. So I liked this, so now I'm in the tips and tricks for improving your creativity in your team for science section of my talk. This is actually a industry or a consulting firm that comes in that tries to improve the creativity in a group. Usually scientists of some type, but quite frequently scientists are out in industry rather than in academic centers. And they have you do a self-assessment and figure out whether you are one of these 4 types. Somebody who's a clarifier, that is, asks the right question. Somebody who's, I apologize for the grammatic error here, ideate, and therefore an ideator, who is somebody who can brainstorm or come up with multiple ideas about that question. Somebody who develops or builds out a solution, and an implementer, somebody who rallies others and executes the solution. The idea is that while you may have some strengths in all 4 of these, or 2 of 4 of these, you will have one that is predominant. And some of the things I learned about this, which I thought were interesting, is that whatever your leader is, if that leader has control over hiring the scientists or attracting the fellows and the postdocs and the junior attendings, they will tend to attract and hire people of the same type. And so you can have one scientist who's great at that research execution, and they will tend to form a team of people who are great at that research execution, which means you don't have anyone covering all parts. So what you do as a group exercise is you figure out what each person's predominant strength is, and you show the distribution on a chalkboard, and then you go and you find people to fill in, which is what we did in this particular thing. So we were low on developers, people who build out solutions. We were great on ask the right question, ideate, and implement. So some of this is actually about the environment. So where they see more creativity happening, there's open hallways and things that are called sand pits. That's where you structurally create an environment where creativity can occur. Introverts tend to prefer small areas, not in front of large windows or aesthetic cool places where they can meet with where they can casually run into 1 or 2 people. Extroverts tend to like those big grand hall openings where there's coffee, and they'll naturally segregate there. So you start thinking about the personality types in your group and whether they have areas where they can, while they're thinking about science, run into somebody else who they then could be appropriately talking about that science with. And I love this. This next concept is liquid networks. You have to have an organizational culture that provides a happy medium between excessive order and anarchy, so that new configurations can emerge through random connections. The system can't be so wildly unstable that it instantly destroys its new creations, but it can't be so rigid that the medical student has to whisper the question to the intern, who whispers the question to the senior resident, who then asks the attending the question. If you're living in that kind of rigid hierarchy, you're not going to have a liquid network. Because most great ideas start out as half-baked. They're something that someone's got a kernel of, and many parts of it are stupid, not thought out, a crazy idea. And you have to have the liquid network where somebody feels comfortable enough to say that over and over again to the statistician, to the vascular biologist, to the exercise physiologist who says, well, I see what you're trying to get at, but you need to be thinking about, from a physiological point of view, that part doesn't make sense. Here it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense here. So if so the idea evolves when you're comfortable saying your stupid idea in front of multiple people, and it's not such a rigid hierarchy that you can't, and it's not so crazy that then becomes the next grant that gets written. So on-demand creativity is not as outrageous as it sounds. You employ divergent thinking to create multiple ideas, fluency, flexibility, or originality, and then you structurally switch people over to convergent thinking to find out what works. And so I'm taking you back to my cycle of grant writing. We were saying that the first 4 weeks were all divergent thinking. Nobody was allowed to talk about how is this going to work, how are we going to get that many hypertensive patients if we've also got that grant that we're thinking of doing that also needs hypertensive patients. You weren't allowed to have those conversations. You just talked about the intellectual contribution, the level of excitement, whether it was the right thing to be doing for that particular person's career. Those were the kinds of things, aspirational, thinking out of the box kind of ideas. And then we all switched ourselves to the convergent thinking, that now we've got the great ideas out there, now we have to curate them. So never ever think outside the box is what it says below. Some social psychologists actually did there's some great cognitive tests for how creative you can be, and randomized undergraduates to standing inside a cut open refrigerator box and generating those ideas, or standing outside of the box, and had a statistical significant difference in the number of ideas the person came up with. I tell you that because I do things like our team, when we've got a really bad problem, we'll go over to a bar and take over one of those high top tables, and everyone comes with their laptop, and we start writing on yellow stickies and slapping them down as fast as I can. I try and do something to get people from breaking from doing it the usual way they would respond. When those new NIH biosketches came out, where you had to write the 5 accomplishments, and everyone was like, "I'm not doing that. Oh, that just sounds awful. I'm not gonna write grants anymore." We actually went over to that same bar, and we took everybody's biosketch and we sent it to the right, and that person wrote the first. What they thought were the accomplishments of the person to their left, and then it went over one to be edited. And then it went over one to be read, and then it went back to the person. And we did this over beer. And we got it done in 3 hours, and everyone had a good time. Well, glasses of wine for some of us. So I try structurally to do what I can, even though this is what my unreconstructed hallway looked like. This is actually a picture from PH back in the 1950s. I think it was a commercial. It was an outward-facing photo. So we came up with the idea of deploying a rapid sequential intervention strategy design with only examining novel intervenable behavior change targets. What I mean by that is we decided, it's very frustrating when you have a good idea and you have to wait for funding and you have to write it 3 times, and then you get to do what's essentially discovery science or dose finding for an initial intervention. We decided what we were going to do is we were going to do 8-week runs of trying something. It would be experimental and, an ABA or whatever was appropriate for the particular target, but we were going to move fast. We were going to, obviously get IRB, but move fast. If it wasn't working, drop it, kill it. So we decided this is the way we're going to at least get to 2 or 3 things that then would be worthy of going forward to something that was a proper system design. And we'd have pieces that we knew early didn't work. We took this through. There's a behavior change wheel that allows you to think through the education, the persuasion needed. So for each of our ideas, they went through this wheel so that we just had bullet points of what we were going to do for each of these things. We actually had a creativity person come in and make us do cartoons. So this is the cartoon that one of the people did of what he was going to do to try and fix this problem if one of his implementation strategies went forward. And somebody else was good with PowerPoint. And so this is actually Harlan Krumholtz's idea that what we do to patients, particularly older patients who are frail, when we bring them into the hospital, is we decondition them. So we lay them in stretchers. They sit there for days on end. We don't feed them properly. They have lights on, so they don't sleep properly. They're very stressed out. We do that for 6 or 7 days, and it's actually the exposures to the stress, sleep fatigue, physical deconditioning, alterations in dietary intake that cause them to have more fainting, disequilibrium, less ability to withstand what happens when they go back home, increasing the probability of an all-cause readmission. So that was someone's cartoon of it. Somebody else did a fishbone diagram, so they wrote out processes, systems, measures, patient factors, increase in 30-day readmission, and they tried to put all of the root causes that they could think of. So this was all the way, each of the scientists was coming up with what was going to be their rapid implementation sequential phase 1 trial. I'm just sort of showing you the process. And you can see people think very differently, approach it very differently, but we were trying to just get people to have ideas. So, what did I do wrong as a leader in this one? I missed the engineer. We had downtown engineers who we were physically meeting on our campus here, and we were meeting at a time they couldn't come. So they weren't showing up and listening to the creativity science, watching us draw the cartoons, having us think about things. And we were about 6 months into this when one of them finally managed, and I didn't change the time or say we're going to hold it sometimes down there and sometimes up here. 6 months in, well in, we'd already designed 4 of the trials, we were submitting IRBs, and one of them shows up 15 minutes late to our think tank and walks in, looks at what we're doing, and says, oh, this is just a classic example of impoverished data on a huge intractable problem with poorly defined hypotheses for which we have no useful tools or interventions. That's exactly what engineers do. That's a quote from him. So he said, this is much more like a complex phenomenon, like weather forecasting, and gave us a historical lecture on Laplace's demon, which is a quote now from mid-century of the 17th century. All positions of all items of which nature is composed, if they could be known, and if the knowledge of laws and physics was perfect, then weather could be predicted perfectly. And then he walked us through how weather forecasting has gone into nonlinear process and chaos theory and has improved tremendously due to their ability to collect data. And here's just one of the graphs he sent us of something he had published, which is the blue line is the machine learning for predicting the weather. The red is the actual weather with the confidence interval around it. And you see they're plotting where there's a discrepancy that led the machine learning to get off. So I didn't show you the second figure, which shows you that they start to get better and better across time. It was a series of graphs that show you. But he said, this is the kind of, I'm agnostic to your hypothesis. You guys are all sitting here trying to come up with hypotheses ahead of time about how you would reduce the preventable readmissions. Why don't we think of it more like this? So he asked us what data we had. And we have lots of data. We have lots of data we don't use in any way whatsoever that we know about patients. And so this pushed us to a completely different place where we now have an R01 to fund this, but we collected the pilot data for that junior physician during the ECRIP. We put sound monitors on patients to follow them through the hospital from the ED. We let them wear a Fitbit so we could see what kind of deconditioning they had. We had a noise monitor that got clipped onto their clipboard, because at that time they still had physical clipboards that were coming from the adult ED up into the bed, and we just started collecting data. So this led to a grant that is now using continuous data in a geomobile fashion, so that we can see where there's noise, where there's light, and now what they've got is an ActiWatch, so they can, just when they're feeling stressed, they can push it and say that they're stressed. So we can start looking at where the hot spots. The engineer was completely correct. Where's there a hot spot? Radiology. You guys maybe who work clinically here in the adult hospital might know, they're over in their beds. They get told that it's time for their radiology. They get pushed there, and then they're there for 4 to 6 hours with nobody talking to them, nobody telling them what's going on. They've missed their meal. Nobody comes and picks them up. You know, they don't have their cell phone because somebody said, "Oh, I'm just taking you to do an MRI or an X-ray," whatever it is that they're doing. So they're pushing their buttons like crazy. I'm stressed. I'm stressed. Now we know where there are things we can actually fix. The next grant said what we want to do is look at that deterioration curve that happens prior to the readmission. So the next grant is actually thinking about home environment. How can we continuously obtain data from the various factors that might actually, with machine learning, be able to start seeing that step function down in deterioration. So there we found one paper that saw when somebody is not ambulating, if their usual pattern is to go to the post office and then walk over here to the grocery store and then come back for an elderly person, actually 7 days before the admission, those trips stop to happen. So if you just have geolocation on the patient, you can see the space that they're traveling through or ambulating through starts to shrink prior to the admission. And so we've now got a monitor for the heart failure patients, and there's a digital app that a nurse can push them and ask, is something going on? Can we send rehab to your house? Do you want to speak to a nurse? They have a number of options they can pick. So we're piloting this now to see if we can figure out what's happening to them out for those people who are at risk for coming back. So can we integrate novel paradigms into our science? In all of the learning that we did through creativity science and some of the things that we saw, I had for a while Rich Leibowitz taking different groups of chief residents or pockets in the hospital out for what I called positive affect-inducing dinners. It was simply to say thank you. It was not to say there's a challenge or there's a problem. It was just, I recognize you work tirelessly and I'm taking the time to thank you, which we were hoping would have a ripple effect for the workforces underneath the people that he took out. We had one resident who came to our think tanks and was listening to everything that we were doing, and he became a chief resident. And so he divided the 180 house staff into 2 different team care approaches with a competition between the 2 of them on some quality metrics that had been intractable in medicine. But he formed them teams. He made them feel connected to each other and like they were trying to beat someone else in improving that. And so both went up a lot. It was a non-significant difference between the 2 teams, and we don't care. We had RFID bracelets that we went multiple times. We were close. It says about here, and this was 2016, and they're still not on the ED patients, but we wanted to be able to start geolocating within the hospital and watching as patients leave, because the leave without being seen is an incredibly important thing to know about and understand what happened to that patient before they decided to walk out. As I say to everyone in my shop, we will fail, but we will persist until we can help improve the behavior of the scientists, the patients, the providers, and the system. Thank you. Good.
Well, Karina, you know, I'm amazed because that's exactly how we do it. Exactly. No, this is, it's obvious why you've been sort of drawn into all these various roles because you bring I won't even call fresh. I mean, you bring a dynamic and enlightened approach to how to maximize systems, environments, and sort of mission-driven efforts. And I love the part that is the touchy-feely. It's all about values and making people feel like they're protected and being helped and so forth. It's not just that you sort of espouse that, but you've been able to implement it because you have to talk the talk, but you have to walk the walk. So there's a lot for us to sort of digest and think about and come back to you on. But in the meantime, let's have some discussion. So Harold?
Absolutely wonderful, Karina. Just terrific presentation. Really very much forces us to rethink how we do things. I think that's terrific. So I have two quick comments and one question. One is, number one, I just want to reemphasize your point about unintended consequences. So one of our health policy fellows, Sharon Inouye from Boston, has a viewpoint coming out in JAMA that one of the things in which hospitals are being penalized is for patient falls. And what the result has been is that people are kept in their beds, which has resulted in deconditioning, which has greatly increased falls when they go back home.
Right.
And rather than getting people to stop walking around, we actually should be mobilizing people in the hospital. Second point.
Before you go on to that other point, can I tell you that one of the medical students who came to some of our think tanks had exactly your reaction. There are all these unintended consequences because we had a whole couple of, I think, 4 months on unintended consequences. And he thought about salt restriction for heart failure patients. They're eating a certain amount of salt. They come in and we salt restrict them. And he thought some of the readmission is rebound. Mm-hmm. So he actually randomized patients to getting a tapering salt restriction, which he had to work with nutrition a lot to do, versus the draconian drop, and found that their rebound water gain was much better in the tapering. With exactly your thought, we really have to think about our policies and what kind of adverse or unintended consequences they have, because some of them are quite profound.
Second point is that you were focusing on heart failure. But to let people know that this is actually being applied in psychiatry, so that the committee that I chair just endorsed having a new measure for all-cause readmissions for people who are hospitalized for mental disorders. So we need to be thinking about this not just for heart failure, but right. Across the board. And most readmissions, by the way, for people with mental disorders are not for mental disorders. They get readmitted for other conditions. The question I had is, what's the role of food in your process? What's the role of food in your process?
I thought he said fruit. Of food. Nutrition?
No, meaning, do you feed people at these meetings? You mentioned going to the bar and so forth, because it's something that I found that food makes a difference.
I do feed people. I set up my PhD supervisor had the idea that if his lab was attractive enough that 24 hours a day graduate students were hanging out there, he had been successful. So he was an early adopter of microwaves, couches, in hallways, snacks kept just out and available for free feeding, because he thought anything that would make somebody walk over from the hospital and hang out a little bit, he was going to do. And so I've adopted that approach. In our shop, we actually have 2 kitchens, and I'm about to build a third. They're not full kitchens. They're just that in the sandpit idea, that place where people can leave their lunches. And then we have, because we don't have a budget that we can pay for food, we have cookie competitions. We have all sorts of things where people bake whatever they like baking, and they're put out for people to eat. And then, people get a prize if they're the ones who brought in the best cookies or whatever. So we try and be inventive in the way that we keep food coming in.
And the sort of more modern approaches to the workplace environment, Google, Microsoft, SAS in North Carolina, Bloomberg. This is what they do. Presumably, it's part of the reasons for their productivity. But a lot of the practical stuff that Harold's saying about looking at unintended consequences and everything, this is what Atul Gawande sort of made his avocation on,
Yes.
basically.
Yes. I will say, what may not be clear, I own a lot of millennials. So some of the senior hospital leadership came to my Christmas party and looked out at the 90 people, and they said, their average age is 25. And, that brings a lot of energy. So if you have a lot of young people who you can give optimism that being in medicine, moving into health sciences research is a great, wonderful thing, I think they then work very hard.
Catherine?
Karina, what an amazing talk. So 2 quick questions on sort of the different areas on which you touched. Did some of what you found so far give you insights in the geographic differences around readmission? I'd just be curious about that. And then more of a question close to home for all of us. Has this given you thoughts about, and in the various positions you're in now in our institution and the medical school wide, about how to break down barriers in terms of our different disciplines and how to, you're really in a sense bringing behavioral health into cardiology very much, integrating 2 disciplines. And has it given you ideas about how, the whole medical center might do more of that?
I became less interested in geographic variation because one of the ideas that really was sticky for me in some of the research and reading that we did is a book I read called N of One Hospital. That what's unique about our patients, our providers, our 11 electronic healthcare EHRs, our 2 Ivy League medical schools, and 4 teaching hospitals doesn't tell us anything about any other hospital, and learning lessons from other hospitals, like knowing how the Cleveland Clinic does something. Much as I enjoyed reading about that, and I did read quite a bit about their culture, their philosophy, what they've done, how they have physician groups set up their quality metrics and hold themselves to it and don't get bonuses and are salaried. It's interesting. It's intellectually stimulating, but not what our problems are and what we need to fix. So I really turned inward and introspective as a result of the sticky idea that each hospital is its own unique phenotype, and we need to solve our own problems, knowing what the realities are on the ground. I've been saying for years over in medicine that I find the physician culture quite punitive, and that without correction, there's a lot of exploitation of the people below, which then means that by the time someone becomes a senior leader, they've had 40 years of exposure to that system and are going to lead that way, and that we have to break that cycle. So NYP is funding 5 physicians and 5 physicians, Columbia and Cornell, to go into their leadership executive training program to work on their strategic initiatives with a sponsor over on the medical school side. And I'm looking for those culture leaders who have that bright optimism, pro-social, mentoring personality. And if this program is successful, we go to 10 and 10, so it'll be 20 a year. And I'm trying to get them out across. One of the things I'm doing is asking that leadership plans be made for each of these people and written down so that we can say, this person is going to go be a division chief over here, and then a quality officer over here, and then have a rotation in finance here, and then come back and be an associate program director there. That's a bit random. They'll be more curated to be what that person needs. But I'm hoping to break down the silos by starting to develop a leader phenotype that sees us, all 3 organizations, as of a piece, and starts working on projects that go across departments and across service lines so that they start pulling in people sort of like our think tanks, who just have great ideas and need to be helped to get those out to become F-31s. You know, the salt restriction guy, he got an F-31, and then he's submitting a K on it. So if I can find the right people, I think that's one of the ways we connect on science and on clinical care. So if we can find projects that people succeed at doing together, then the silos become less relevant.
You don't have to answer this question, but instead of picking these 5 people like you do from the junior rank, why don't you just start at the top?
No, I'm going to answer that. I actually said, I see burnout in our middle ranks. I got asked, you should be doing mid-level because they're going to be the next senior leaders. And I said, if someone's been here 15 or 20 years, they're really a hardy type if they haven't absorbed the culture. So I'm trying to get to people who are still malleable. Some of it is being non-defensive, and that's just a cultural thing. I don't know your area. I don't know this. I don't know what a business plan is. And I think by the time you've been in this system for 20 years, you've been punished if your answer is you don't know. It's correct to act like you know everything.
So Harold
I hope I don't disclose too much.
So Harold and I are lost causes, huh?
I said hardy phenotypes. There are hardy phenotypes out there.
Oh, good. I'll take that as a compliment. David, then Bill.
So I have a nephew who's a programmer who's worked for Bridgewater, which is the largest hedge fund, and designed programs for now Bungie, which does Halo, the largest multiplayer massive game thing. So both of these organizations have, and so in Google too, I think may have been the first, have systems that are very similar to yours for getting collaborative work together. A, do you look at their systems to help get inspiration of how to do this systemic intervention? And B, what about things that are not an outflow that's a social organizational system invention? I mean, what about just individual inventions? I mean, what would Tesla think?
What would Tesla think of this kind of organization?
Yeah. Of this kind of innovative, I mean, this is an innovative strategy. What would very individual inventors, what do they think? I mean, or is there maybe a place for individual inventors that are maybe nerdy and seclusive and not?
So one of the lessons I learned, I go back in history and then I answer your question. One of the lessons I learned as a clinical psychologist in multiple clinical psychology training programs is we always insisted that applicants look us in the face and say, I'm dying to be a researcher. The reason I'm doing 5 years of clinical training is so that I can be an R01 funded investigator. And of course, we only took those people, and of course, 80% of them didn't go into science. So across the years of seeing that as a failure, I started eventually getting my head around the fact that you want people to succeed where their joy is. And if you say, if you want to be a private practitioner, I'm here to help you, but I want you to represent Columbia well. I want you to be the best private practitioner we send out there. If you want to be an entrepreneur, then I'm sending you to the downtown business school campus to learn patent and whatnot. So I've got 3 junior cardiologists who have all spun off companies, are all now meeting with firms. One of them started looking up patents and found 5 or 6 and went and spoke to those people and now has submitted his own, because we have people here who know how to do that. We just often don't have a systematic way of getting the junior people who have the fire in the belly to want to do that into staying with us and getting the knowledge they need. So I'm kind of agnostic as to where people go, as long as they are doing something that is important, and that's what I try and focus.
Bill?
I think it's just...
I'm just trying to shout this out because the technology is not... I just remember when I was a student here, it was clear that if you were interested in, if you just wanted to do clinical work, well, okay, well, cool, that's very nice. If you wanted to teach, that was a little better, but what we're really trying to produce at Columbia are people who can do research. And you're operationalizing that for the medical center in an enlightened way. I wanted to pick up on specifically on a question, on a point that Harold made about the fact that the penalty for quick readmissions is going to go from quickly already from cardiology and congestive heart failure to people with repeated psychiatric hospitalizations. And the question is, what do you do with something that's outside the box? For example, one of the things that keeps people from readmissions is if you go is a follow-up visit, right? You've got to get some kind of care, assuming it's good. But if people don't show up, they get closed out, and that's the end, and they're going to be back in the emergency room. So the one answer to that is not what the hospital does, not what the clinic does, but outreach. So, but if you don't have outreach in your system, how do you take an idea like that may work and integrate it?
So I had the privilege, really it was a privilege, to go teach an undergrad engineering course down at the Columbia main campus because I wanted to learn about lean and some of the more recent theories, and the way I learn is I teach. So I had 30 undergrad engineers who I said they all had to do an applied project, and one of them I put on the applied project that out of medicine admissions, this is all, not heart failure or anything, of the denominator of people who are given an AIM clinic follow-up in the follow-up clinic, they have a 40% show rate, so a 60% no-show rate. So what the industrial engineers did is they do time motion studies, they do fishbone analyses, they use the tools that they have. And I'm just telling you some incredibly prosaic things that we found, but this is what fixed it. The resident was responsible for finding the appointment time because the unit assistants weren't doing it. So the resident can only call from 9 to 5, which is when someone is answering, for the follow-up clinic, which has hours, nights and weekends. They just don't have the phone staffed. So there's no online calendaring for it. The resident eventually finds another resident who's inside the clinic, who looks on the paper calendar, finds a time, says, okay, Monday at 2 p.m. And then the social worker is told, okay, go tell the patient they've got to follow up Monday at 2 p.m. Patient isn't asked, is that a time that works for you? Patient is verbally told it. System doesn't phone the patient the night before to make sure that they know where it is and how to get there and whatnot. I'm shocked that 40% show up. Shocked. So their project, because they were industrial engineers who had to improve a system, they got an online calendar that everyone could get to 24 hours a day, and they put it on an app so the resident on their personal mobile phone, because that's a problem, but whatever, could pull up that app and say which of these times work for you. We still had to handwrite it out for the person. We didn't get to as far as how to get that app to get to a printer so that it was written out in Spanish for the patient and handed to them. But then it started being handwritten on the discharge order, and it immediately bumped up almost 25%. So long story, sometimes you have to go watch to figure out why is it that people can't access the follow-up care that they need. I think that's that N of one hospital problem again. This won't generalize to anything else, but eyes on the problem is remarkably sometimes revealing of what are the issues if you're a patient trying to access our system.
It ain't rocket science.
No.
We're going to have to stop now, but thanks, Karina, for a really inspirational talk. And there'll be lunch upstairs where Karina will hold forth for an additional amount of time.